Today I'm going to review the Speedmasters on sale at Phillips Geneva, and the auction is on 28 June. And before I do, I just have to mention that I've got no connection to the watches, no connection to Phillips. The only connection I have is that I'm a very keen amateur collector who enjoys talking about watches. So, having said that, let's look at them. There are 4 watches. The first one is a 2998-1, very nice caramel chocolate dial. And then we have a 105012-66 with a CB case. Now we have an Ultraman, a 145012. Phillips have managed to find another one of these extremely rare watches somewhere. And lastly, we have a 2998 FAP. So I'm going to look at each one of these in turn and go through them the way I would go through them if I was sitting in front of them. The first one is a caramel chocolate dial 2998-1. Estimate 25 to 45,000 Swiss francs. Strikes me as slightly cheap. We'll see. Now look at that dial. It's fantastic. The color is fantastic. I've seen watches this color before, and they're lovely. They're lovely. What we've got to look at is make sure that the dial itself is in good condition. The body color, the sort of the what is now brown paint. Check it for integrity. And as I go around this watch, I can't see any bubbles or scratches or damage or oil spills or anything. It's really lovely, this dial. The dial itself is a radium dial with no step, Swiss made at the bottom, and an oval omega at in the text, with short indices on the right-hand subdial. Of course, it's got long hour markers. It's correct, and it looks really, really attractive. There's something going on at the 9 o'clock marker near the silver ring under the crystal. I don't know what that is. I think it might be dirt or a light artifact or something. But it's there, and we should know about it. Still on the dial, now I look at the lume markers, and the lume markers complement the color of the dial perfectly. Now I want to go through every single lume marker and look at it and see if it's been adjusted. I really don't think any of these lume markers have been adjusted. It's just that they look so perfect on this dial, you know, the color, and they look so patinated, if you like. It's lovely. I mean, everything is really good. It's really good on this dial. So I'm happy with that. Next, I'm going to look at that bezel, which is the base 1000 bezel. Incredibly rare thing on its own. This one has the dent at 80 to 85. That's a real shame. The color looks pretty good. Sometimes these black base 1000 bezels can fade or get on a sort of sheen on them so that they reflect the light and they don't look so good. But this one looks like it's got a good depth of color. The print is clear. It's a good bezel. Apart from the dent, which, you know, we can always wish it wasn't there, it's a good bezel. So that's good too. The case, quite hard to assess in these photographs. But what we can do is when we look at the photograph at the back, we can see that the back has been polished. The text, Speedmaster, and the hippocampus, they're slightly soft and blurred. There's a failed opening mark, and that's been softened a little bit on the wheel. And the bevel, the size of the first bevel on the case back at the edge, is a little large. So I'm pretty sure that that case back has been polished. This also brings me to the dark appearing, looks like dirt under the lugs in near the lip of the caseback. I think it's corrosion. I think it's very mild corrosion. These early cases quite often showed corrosion. I don't know if it was the steel or what it was, but it's not an uncommon thing to see. I've seen it more in 2915s than I have in 2998s. It's not serious, but it is there. I'm not sure whether it will get any worse if it is corrosion. On the other hand, it's entirely possible that Phillips haven't cleaned the watch and it's a bit of dirt. But from my experience, if I had to make that judgment, I think that's corrosion. A last point on the case is that the front photographs make the lugs look quite well defined. I can't tell whether or not they've had any significant polishing. There is a video that goes with this watch, and I urge you to go and see it. I'll leave the link in the description. Looking again from the back, we can see that the crown is a Mercedes crown with a little symbol in the middle of Omega. The pushers have dirty necks, which always pleases me, and the caps are the correct vintage shape. So I'm happy with the crown and pushers. Last thing to look at is the hands. So these watches all had alpha hour-minute hands, and some had triangle loom, some had square, narrow slots, which we see here. And I've seen so many different alpha hands. It's hard to know, what the story is. I suspect Omega had many suppliers, and I prefer to see the triangle hour hand, but I believe that the straight, the narrow slots are just as original. I just prefer the other ones. And these ones, I don't know enough about them to tell you whether they're the original ones to the watch or not. They might be. They haven't got any loom. And so, one possible scenario is that the hands were put on the watch recently and they were slightly later and had tritium in them. And so tritium was removed, and rather than relooming the hands, which would be quite obvious, they didn't put any loom in at all. Alternatively, it could be they're the original hands and that the loom was flaky and they just removed it. Either way, in a watch of this value, the value of the hands is a relatively small percentage of the value, so I wouldn't really worry about it. And it does have this fabulous lollipop, and whilst I wonder if the lollipop loom is radium or not, the only way to find that out is to take it off the watch and to test it. Even if I bought the watch, I wouldn't go out of my way to do that until I serviced it. The subdial hands, these look like original vintage. So overall, we have an extremely attractive, almost all correct 2998, and in addition Phillips telling us that it's possibly the very first one, because the serial number is the earliest I've ever seen, and in fact ends in 3 zeros. Very unusual number. And so it might possibly be. Has an extract showing it delivered to France in 1959, and it's estimated 25 to 45,000. Comes with a correct vintage box, which I would bet almost anything has nothing to do with this watch, other than that similar watches were sold in it. I can't believe that watch came in this particular box, but it is nice to have. They're worth a bit of money too. Question is, how much is this watch going to sell for? It could sell for quite a lot. These brown dials are very sought after. Certainly, I think the estimate is on the low side, because if you said, would I like to buy this watch for 25,000, even plus the 25% commission, I would snatch your hand off. This is a fantastic watch at that price. Is it worth 45,000? Not to me, but only because of current circumstances. I'm not in the mood to buy a watch this at $57,000, which is what you would end up paying if you paid the high estimate. And that's another thing. If you are looking to buy an attractive watch, and this is an attractive watch and it's going to be fought over, it's no point in looking at the low estimate thinking, oh yes, I'll buy it for the low estimate, because you won't. You have to be looking at the high estimate and wondering how many bids over the high estimate you want to go before you buy it. In a watch like this, which is very rare, very special, you have to dig in and bid hard if you want to win it, because if you don't, someone else will. And with that, we'll go on to the next watch. Here we have the 105 012 66 with a CB case. Immediately, whenever I see a 105 012, I check the pushers, and I check that the pushers have these fat necks, because if it doesn't have the fat necks, it's almost a no-go from the start, unless it's extremely cheap. This one has the fat neck pushers immediately obvious. So we will continue, and we'll do it the same way that I always do a watch. The first thing to do is to look at the dial, and this is a stepped dial with the T Swiss made T, and it's wide T mark, so that's from a late one, and indeed this one I think is a 68 on the extract. And the first thing to check is the body color, and the black on this dial is very slightly faded. It's not a deep, rich black. So that's one thing to shape our assessment, the color of the dial. There's some marks which are possibly on the crystal. We don't have enough photographs to verify it. And there are some other marks on this watch that are definitely not on the crystal and worry me. There's a mark in the subdial near the 9. There's a possible oil mark near the 8 o'clock plot. And in general, the dial looks like it's not a fine dial. There's something going on at the 12 o'clock minute mark too. Now, it wouldn't stop me buying a watch if it was the right price. This dial, I've seen much worse. Some people might call it character, but you must take into account these blemishes before buying this watch. Now I look at the minute track. See, I always use the same methods. I keep going through the same methods. Minute track looks pretty good. The print, that's also pretty good. There's no damage there. And so then we come to the loom, and the loom on this watch is disappointing. Although Phillips see fit to remark on it specifically that it's an untouched watch. Well, that leads me to ask, why don't they say that about all the other watches? That aside, it's quite obvious to me that this is an untouched loom watch, because the loom is so patchy, inconsistent, not very attractive colour, and missing in parts. It's not a great loom. The overall look of the dial isn't bad. It's just, it's not a valuable dial. It's a commercial dial. The bezel on this watch is on first sight you think that's a very clean dot over 90 bezel. If you look closely, there's one or two little marks, and it's got a few issues, but it's still pretty good. Still a pretty good bezel. That in itself is worth some serious money. And now we go on to the case, and it's a 66 CB case, which means it's supposed to have some facet lines down the lugs. And this particular example has lost the definition on these facet lines that make the particular reference so desirable, which is going to make it interesting to try and sell to a knowledgeable collector, because he'll be buying this watch for those facet lines, and as we can see, these lines are not well defined. You can see traces of them, but they're not well defined. And again, it doesn't mean the watch shouldn't be bought, it just means it needs to be bought at the right value. So that is the case. Disappointing. Now, I touched on the pushers, and they look original, fat-necked, low pushers, so I'm happy with those. Yeah, I can't quite see what that crown is. It just doesn't look too happy to me. There's a big gap at the edges of the crown. Not sure why. Not a huge deal. Not a huge deal if it turns out to be incorrect. It possibly could be, but it's not a huge deal. It's just money. So there's quite a lot of stuff going on with this watch that is going to cost money. And we haven't even got to the hands yet. So the hands, the hour and the minute loom don't match each other, so they're possibly not original to each other. And the central chrono hand has a square end, and I don't see any square end central chrono hands in 105012s. So I think this particular watch has had the hands replaced. Putting them back to original to make the watch look much nicer is going to cost you a fair bit, because not only is it going to cost you a fair bit, but unless you find a vintage set, you're going to have to distress a new set, and that's always going to be a distressed new set of hands on this watch. I don't really talk about bracelets an awful lot, but we can see from this photograph that the bracelet is it's got gaps, and it looks very, very tired, and it's quite possible that if you buy this watch or hold it, you know the bracelet's flapping around like a hose pipe. It's I'm not sure that bracelet is going to be worth having. So overall, this watch is a little bit tired, and the question is it worth the estimate? Not really. Not really, because at $8,500 to $12,800, at $8,500 you're paying $10,600 including commission. I suppose that's not crazy money. That's not crazy money, even with the problems. But I think $15,000 would be disappointing. If you ended up with that and you paid $15,000 for it, I think you might find you could have bought something else for the same money that would be slightly better. It's hard to tell with these watches, because this is a low quality example with several things wrong with it, but it's not $20,000. So somebody who buys it for $10,000 might go, woohoo, I've got a 105012 for $10,000. with only a few things wrong with it and the right pushers. So, these things always find a home in the end. It wouldn't find a home with me. I think that this would not be a rewarding watch for me to own, because I think I know too much about it. I think that dial might be a little disappointing in real life. I'm quite happy to be proved wrong. And again, as I said, at the low estimate, it's not going to be bad. Okay, let's go on to the Ultraman. The Ultraman being a 145012-67. This one sold to Sweden. And it's a little bit tired. The dial has several issues going on. The body color is a little faded. But most worrying is the white degradation around the subdials and the step. I often see this in watches where the dial has spent time outside of the watch. I don't know if that's the case here, but I do know that the dial isn't that great. There are some Ultraman collectors who believe that the dial on an Ultraman should be this glossy black. I'm not sure I agree with them, because I've seen so many Ultramen with dials like this actually that are not gloss black, and so I don't think it's an indication. What we do have to look for is the long orange-red hand, which is present in this watch. Interestingly, the center post of the hand, the rivet, is clearly has been replaced, and this is a very delicate operation. Watchmakers don't like doing it. Don't blame them. But it's done because the hand, with this extra mill, is so very, very valuable. I mean, if you think that this watch is estimated 20 to 30,000 Swiss francs, it would be lucky to get half that without the orange hand. So we look at the body color of the dial, and as I said, it's got several problems and issues. It's also got some damage at the 39-minute mark, and also very light hand damage on the lower hour subdial. It's small, but it's there. The rest of the dial is in such a state that the hand damage is of the severity of a light severity, so I'm not too worried about it. I mean, this whole watch is of a quality, shall we say. It's going to be one of the least expensive Ultramen sold, I think. You never know, maybe it's going to go nuts. The bezel, it's deceptive, this bezel, because the main photograph shows it looking quite nice with just a little bit of either corrosion or dirt around the sort of tachymeter letters round to 350, and then also around the 120 to 150 mark. But when we look at the other photo, the side-on photo, we can see the bezel's quite tired and damaged and scratched. It's a correct bezel, but it's not a great bezel. The case, well, it looks quite... It's got a few marks and damages, you can see that in the photos, but the worst part about it is it has the engraving on the back, which doesn't look nice, and so I think it's a real shame. However, it's an inexpensive Ultraman. It's not a $40,000 Ultraman. I've seen them sell for $40,000 to $60,000 US. It's a $20,000, $25,000 with the commission. It's not an expensive watch, so if you're looking for an Ultraman, it will be worth looking at, definitely, at the low estimate. Last watch in the series is this 2998-5, which was issued to the Peruvian Air Forces. Rather pleasingly, the estimate seems to not give much of a premium for the Air Force. It's estimated at 15 to 25,000 Swiss francs. I think that's a pretty reasonable estimate, to be perfectly honest. It's immediately, you can see some things going on with it, but we'll go through it from the bottom. So the dial, black dial, Swiss made, which is correct. This is the later 2998 dial, so we've got long indices on the right hand subdial. On the body colour, this dial, I'll bet you when you see it in real life, it's got sort of slightly uneven colouring, slightly blotchy, very slight. It's slightly dried out, I think. Honestly, it's one of the better condition FAP watches I've seen, because quite often they're heavily damaged, and indeed the bezel and the case on this do show wear. But back to the dial. As I said, there's blotches and stuff going on. There's something going on in the central subdial up near the sort of 10-11 marker, and in general the dial I don't think is a smooth, even black. The print, well, that's intact all the way around. The minute track is intact. The rest of the print is also intact. The loom, a little bit uneven, but probably looks good in real life and probably looks like it fits with the rest of the watch. They don't give us much to go on for the case, apart from these front shots which show the lugs are quite severely polished. They've lost the definition and the lines of the original, and again, not surprising to see in an FAP. Not surprising at all. The crown and pushers, I suspect that they have been replaced at some time, but they look like original specifications. Again, military watch, I'm not too bothered by it. Again, and it's at a price. Last thing to talk about is the hands. The alpha hour-minute hands. I'm trying desperately to see a transverse curve. If these hands are flat in real life, then they're modern replacements. They could be modern replacements. The photograph does not let me really see if they've got a transverse curve. This view makes me think there might be one there, but I'd put a loop on it and check the edge of the hands and see how they're finished. The reason is because on a watch of this value, the wrong hands are sort of 10% of the value, and so it's quite important to find out. At the price, at the low estimate, it's not a bad watch actually. It's not a bad watch at the low estimate. I like the look of it. Of course, there is a chrono creep on the hour chronograph hand, the bottom subdial. But there's going to, any watch that I buy out of an auction, I know I'm going to have to service, and it's going to cost about £500 to service properly. You want to get a 321 serviced for £300, be my guest. But if you sell it to me, I'll do it again. And so there you have it. Those are the 4 watches on offer at Phillips. If you buy one of them, I wish you every luck. I don't think you'd be making a mistake by buying any of these watches at the low estimate, and I think you'd be making no mistake at all to buy the caramel dial at the high estimate. Nice selection of watches. Phillips is a good house. They can find some interesting watches. I wish I was there to see the whole auction, and whoever buys it, good luck to you.